Snow drifted quietly over the Blue Ridge Mountains that night as a mother German shepherd pushed through the cold, one fragile puppy held in her jaws, 5 more struggling behind her in the white. She wasn't running from the storm. She was carrying hope straight into it. Miles away, inside a small mountain cabin, a retired Navy SEAL sat alone by the fire, unaware that everything he thought was over was about to begin again. Late winter had settled over the Blue Ridge Mountains with a quiet firmness that didn't howl or threaten but pressed steadily into the land, turning the forest into a muted stretch of white and gray where time felt slower, heavier, as if the world itself had decided to speak more softly. Snow had been falling since afternoon, not in angry sheets but in patient layers that clung to pine branches and buried the narrow dirt road leading up to a single weathered cabin perched above a shallow ravine. The cabin belonged to Michael Harris, a retired Navy SEAL in his mid-40s, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose posture still carried the disciplined economy of someone trained to move with purpose even when standing still. His dark hair had begun to gray at the temples, kept short out of habit rather than style, and a trimmed beard lined his square jaw, rough with the kind of stubble that came from forgetting the mirror more often than not. His face was marked by angles sharpened by years of command and loss, cheekbones pronounced, eyes a steady steel blue that missed very little, yet often looked past what was directly in front of him. To strangers, Michael might have seemed distant, even cold, but those who had known him before the war would have recognized the distance as something learned, not chosen, a barrier built after too many moments when caring had come at too high a cost. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of burning pine and old wood, the fire crackling low in the stone hearth as Michael sat alone in a heavy chair pulled close to the warmth, his elbows resting on his knees, hands loosely clasped as he stared into the shifting orange light. He had learned long ago that silence could be louder than gunfire, and tonight the quiet pressed against his ears with the same insistence as the snow pressing against the windows. The cabin was sparse but orderly, everything in its place, not from pride but from control. Order was something he could manage when the rest of the world felt unreliable. A folded blanket lay on the couch, boots were lined neatly by the door, and on the mantel above the fire sat a single framed photograph turned face down. Its presence felt even without being seen. Michael hadn't touched it in years. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what it held. Outside, the snow deepened, and with it came a sound that did not belong to wind or shifting branches. It was faint at first, almost easy to dismiss, a soft scraping that might have been ice sliding from the roof or a pine cone dropping under the weight of snow. Michael's head lifted slightly, instinct stirring without conscious permission, his body responding before his mind caught up. The sound came again, uneven, hesitant, followed by a pause that felt deliberate. His fingers tightened together, breath slowing, heart rate steadying the way it had always done when something unknown approached. He stood, boots heavy against the wooden floor, and moved toward the door with the quiet precision of someone who had spent years learning how not to be heard. When he opened it, the cold rushed in immediately, sharp and clean, carrying with it a swirl of snowflakes that scattered across the floorboards. The forest beyond was dim and colorless, the sky low and pale, and standing there on the threshold, framed by falling snow, was a German shepherd. She was large but lean, her black and tan coat dulled by wet snow clinging to her sides, ribs faintly visible beneath her fur, not from neglect, but from the strain of survival. Her ears stood alert yet relaxed, and her amber eyes were fixed on Michael with a steadiness that held no fear, only intention. In her mouth, held with extraordinary care, was a tiny puppy, its body limp with exhaustion but its chest rising and falling in shallow, determined breaths. Behind her, partially obscured by the swirling white, were small paw prints leading back into the storm, uneven and close together, the marks of other puppies struggling to keep up. The dog did not bark. She did not whine or step forward. She simply stood there, snow gathering along her back, eyes locked on Michael as if measuring him not as a threat or a savior, but as a possibility. Michael felt something tighten in his chest, a sensation he hadn't felt in a long time. Not fear, not pity, but recognition. He had seen that look before, not in animals, but in men, in soldiers who had reached the edge of what they could endure and chosen to keep going anyway. Slowly, deliberately, he crouched to her level, his movements careful, his voice low and unused as he spoke. "You picked a bad night," he murmured, more to himself than to her, the words rough in his throat. The shepherd's gaze did not waver. Snow slid from her ears as she tilted her head slightly, adjusting her grip on the puppy without tightening her jaws. Michael noticed the detail without thinking, the way one notices discipline in another professional. His eyes flicked briefly to the ground, to the paw prints half filled with snow, counting them by instinct, more than one, more than two, his mind already assembling the shape of what she was asking without any sound at all. A memory rose uninvited, sharp and warm all at once, of his wife standing in the doorway of this same cabin years earlier, bundled in a sweater too big for her, smiling the way she always did when she thought he was taking the long way around something simple. She had believed fiercely in small meanings, in the idea that nothing arrived by accident, that every living thing that crossed your path carried a purpose even if you didn't understand it yet. Losing her had been the moment Michael stopped opening doors he didn't absolutely have to. The war had taken parts of him, but grief had taught him how to close what was left. He looked back at the dog, at the puppy, trembling slightly now as the cold crept deeper, and felt the weight of that old belief press gently against the walls he'd built. Without standing, he shifted to the side and pulled the door wider open, the firelight spilling out onto the snow like an invitation he hadn't planned to give. "Come on," he said quietly. "It's warm." The German shepherd hesitated, not out of fear but assessment, her eyes flicking briefly past him into the cabin, toward the fire, the space, the unknown. Then she stepped forward, crossing the threshold with deliberate care, her paws leaving dark, melting prints on the wood. She moved directly to the rug near the hearth and lowered her head, easing the puppy onto the floor with a gentleness that made Michael swallow hard. The puppy shivered, let out a faint sound, and curled instinctively toward the heat. The dog remained standing, turning her head back toward the open door, eyes tracking the storm beyond as if counting time. Michael grabbed the blanket from the chair and knelt, wrapping the puppy carefully, his large hands surprisingly gentle, aware of every fragile movement beneath his fingers. When he looked up again, the shepherd had shifted her weight, one step closer to the door, then paused, glancing back at him, her gaze holding his for a long, silent moment. In that look was no demand, no submission, only a question carried on trust alone. Michael felt it land with the weight of an oath. The fire crackled behind him. The storm whispered outside, and for the first time in years, he did not close the door immediately. He held it open, meeting her eyes, understanding without words that this night was not finished, asking him who he still was. The door stayed open. Michael Harris did not close it after the mother dog crossed the threshold, did not pull it shut against the cold or the wind that slipped inside with quiet insistence, carrying flakes of snow that melted into dark specks on the wooden floor. He left it open because something in him understood, with the same certainty he once used to read terrain and threat, that the night was not finished and neither was she. Grace stood near the hearth only briefly, long enough to ensure the warmth held, long enough to feel the room settle around the small wrapped bundle on the rug. Then she turned back toward the door, her body angled forward, weight shifting with purpose. Michael watched her silhouette framed against the white outside and felt a familiar tightening at the base of his throat. The recognition of a pattern he knew too well, the rhythm of movement out into danger and back again that defined men who did not calculate survival for themselves alone. When she stepped back into the storm, he did not call after her or try to stop her. He simply moved the chair closer to the fire, added another log with practiced hands, and positioned himself where he could see both the door and the fragile rise and fall of the puppy's chest. Time stretched in that space between footsteps, the fire crackling low, the wind brushing the eaves, and Michael's thoughts drifting to places he usually kept sealed. He had learned in war that waiting could be an action, that stillness, when chosen, carried its own weight. The first return came sooner than he expected. Grace reappearing with another small body in her mouth, snow caked heavier along her shoulders now, breath coming in visible clouds as she crossed the porch and stepped inside without hesitation. Michael rose immediately, kneeling to receive the puppy as she lowered it beside its sibling, her movements careful, almost ceremonial. He wrapped the second pup, positioned it close to the heat, and noticed the faint tremor in his hands, not from cold, but from the quiet intensity of the moment. Grace did not linger. She turned and went back out again, her paws leaving fresh prints over the older ones already half filled by snow. With each trip, the night pressed deeper, the wind picking up, and Michael felt the cabin transform into something else entirely, no longer a place of retreat, but a forward position, a line held against the elements. He kept the fire fed, adjusted the blankets, and spoke softly without realizing it. Fragments of reassurance meant perhaps for the dogs, perhaps for himself. By the third return, Grace's gait had changed, her movements slower, shoulders rolling with visible effort as she carried another puppy inside. Michael noticed the way her ribs expanded and contracted, the faint hitch in her breath, and something in his chest tightened with a protective instinct that surprised him with its immediacy. He had buried that instinct once, convinced it only led to loss, but here it was again, uninvited and undeniable. He glanced toward the old phone mounted on the wall, the cord coiled neatly, unused for days, and hesitated before picking it up. There was only one person he trusted to understand without explanation, someone who would not ask him to choose between protocol and compassion. Emily Walker lived a few miles down the mountain road, a widow in her early 60s with a slight frame and an unassuming presence that belied a lifetime of resilience. She had served as a military nurse decades earlier, her posture still upright, her movements efficient, though softened now by age and gentleness. Emily had silver-streaked brown hair she wore pulled back in a practical knot, pale skin weathered by mountain air, and eyes the color of faded moss that held a calm steadiness Michael had always respected. They were not close friends, but they shared a quiet understanding, a mutual nod when they passed at the general store, a recognition born of having seen enough to know when words were unnecessary. When she answered the phone, her voice was clear, alert, and free of surprise. Michael explained the situation in simple terms, his tone even, leaving out nothing essential, and Emily listened without interruption. "I'll come as soon as I can," she said, already moving in his mind's eye, pulling on boots, reaching for gloves, her practicality rising to meet the need. "Keep them warm. You're doing the right thing." The line went dead, and Michael returned his focus to the door just in time to see Grace reappear again, this time stumbling slightly as she crossed the threshold. He moved to steady her without thinking, his hand hovering close but not touching, respecting the space she clearly commanded. She lowered another puppy, then stood there for a moment longer than before, her head dipping slightly as if gathering herself. Michael met her eyes and saw exhaustion layered beneath resolve, a familiar combination that pulled a memory from him unbidden, of men slumped against walls between missions, saving strength for the next push. "You're not done yet," he murmured, not as an order but an acknowledgement. Grace turned and went back out, disappearing into the white. The waiting stretched again, heavier now, the wind rattling the doorframe, snow blowing in small drifts across the porch. Michael found himself standing instead of sitting, his body refusing rest, every sense tuned outward. When she returned with the fifth puppy, her steps were labored, her flanks heaving, and Michael felt the urge to intervene, to insist she stop. But he understood that this was not his call to make. He received the pup, wrapped it, and watched as Grace turned back toward the storm one last time, her silhouette pausing at the threshold. The minutes that followed felt longer than any firefight he could remember, each second marked by the sound of the fire and the small, fragile breaths of the puppies behind him. When Grace finally reappeared with the last puppy, she moved with a careful deliberation that bordered on reverence, every step chosen, every muscle working beyond fatigue. Michael stepped back, opening the door wider, clearing her path, and when she crossed into the cabin, he closed the door behind her for the first time that night, sealing out the storm. Grace lowered the final puppy, then stood for a moment as if unsure whether to remain upright or collapse, before easing herself down beside the small cluster of bodies, her head resting on the floor, breath deep and uneven. Michael crouched near her, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her fur, close enough to see the subtle rise and fall of her chest begin to steady. He reached out slowly, palm open, stopping just short of contact, giving her the choice. Grace did not move away. She simply closed her eyes, her body curling slightly toward the puppies, trust offered without ceremony. Michael felt the weight of the night settle into him, a quiet awe replacing the tension that had carried him through the hours. He leaned closer and whispered, his voice rough with emotion he did not bother to hide. "You remind me of the best soldiers I ever knew." And for the first time in a very long while, the words did not feel like a farewell. Morning arrived quietly over the Blue Ridge Mountains, not with sunlight spilling in all at once, but with a pale gray glow that softened the edges of the forest and made the world feel tentative, as if it were checking whether it was safe to begin again. The storm had eased some time before dawn, leaving behind a heavy stillness broken only by the faint hiss of melting snow sliding from pine needles and the slow, steady breathing inside Michael Harris's cabin. The fire had burned low through the night, reduced to glowing embers that cast a dull warmth across the wooden floor, where Grace lay curled around her litter, her body forming a protective arc, her breathing deep and uneven, but finally at rest. Michael sat nearby on the floor with his back against the hearth, having never fully slept, his eyes moving from the dogs to the door and back again, his body caught in that half-alert state familiar to anyone who had learned not to trust peace too quickly. When the sound of tires crunching slowly on snow reached him from outside, he rose at once, joints stiff, heart steady, and opened the door to the sight of Emily Walker stepping carefully from her aging pickup. She looked smaller in the daylight than she had in his memory, bundled in a thick wool coat the color of damp stone, her scarf wrapped high around her neck, gray-brown hair escaping its knot in wisps that caught the light. Emily was in her early 60s, slender but not fragile, her posture upright despite the years, her movements economical and sure. Her face carried fine lines etched by weather and worry rather than vanity, her skin pale and lightly freckled, and her eyes soft green, observant, unflinching, took in the scene with professional calm before emotion ever had a chance to rise. She did not rush forward or speak immediately. She simply met Michael's gaze, nodded once in greeting, and stepped inside as if she had been expected all along. The warmth of the cabin hit her at once, and she loosened her coat, kneeling slowly beside Grace without hesitation, careful not to crowd her. Grace lifted her head slightly, ears twitching, eyes following Emily's movements, alert but not defensive. Michael watched closely, ready to intervene if needed, but Emily moved with the ease of someone who had spent years reading bodies under stress, human and otherwise. She let Grace sniff her gloved hand, then rested it lightly on the floor, offering presence rather than touch. "You did good," Emily murmured, her voice low and steady, not directed at Michael but at Grace, as if speaking to one mother from another who understood the cost of staying awake through the night. Grace exhaled slowly and lowered her head again, accepting her. Emily turned her attention to the puppies then, leaning closer, her practiced eyes scanning their small bodies, counting breaths, noting movement. She pointed gently to one pup near the edge of the cluster, smaller than the others, its fur damp and matted, its sides fluttering with shallow effort. "That one's struggling," she said quietly, not alarmed, but certain. Michael crouched beside her, his large frame folding inward, and for a moment they worked in silence, adjusting blankets, shifting the puppy closer to warmth. The pup let out a faint sound, barely more than a whisper, and Emily's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She had heard that sound before, decades ago, in places she rarely spoke about. As they worked, time slowed again, measured not in minutes but in breaths and small signs of life. Emily showed Michael how to rub the puppy gently with a cloth, how to stimulate circulation without exhausting it, her hands sure, her touch precise. Watching her, Michael felt a strange familiarity settle in. Not attraction, not yet, but recognition. She moved the way medics did under pressure, calm on the surface, everything essential happening beneath. When the puppy's breathing steadied slightly, Emily leaned back on her heels, letting out a controlled breath of her own. "It's going to be close," she said, meeting Michael's eyes. "But close doesn't mean lost." They sat back against the wall then, the dogs resting between them. The fire coaxed back to life with a fresh log. The cabin filled with a quiet intimacy that had nothing to do with closeness of bodies and everything to do with shared vigilance. Michael poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs without asking, handing one to Emily, and she accepted it with a nod, wrapping her hands around the warmth. They did not talk at first. They did not need to. Outside, the mountain exhaled as the storm retreated, and inside, 2 people who had spent years carrying silence let it stretch without fear. It was Emily who spoke first, her gaze resting on Grace, on the curve of her spine sheltering her young. "My husband used to sleep like that," she said softly, almost to herself. "Curled around the kids when they were sick, like he thought he could keep the world out just by being there." Michael did not look at her, but his chest tightened. "Mine believed that too," he replied after a moment, voice low. She said staying was its own kind of courage. The words surprised him with their ease. He had not spoken of his wife aloud in years. Emily glanced at him then, not with pity, but with understanding, the kind that came from loss worn long enough to soften its sharpest edges. She told him about her husband, a Marine who never came back from overseas, about the knock on the door that had rearranged her life without warning, about learning how to wake up alone without letting the emptiness define her. Michael listened, his face still, his hands wrapped tight around his mug, and when he spoke of the war, of the way it followed him home and settled into his bones, Emily did not interrupt or rush to comfort. She simply stayed, allowing the truth of it to exist between them without judgment. Their shared history unfolded quietly, 2 parallel lines drawn close enough to recognize themselves in each other without crossing too soon. A small sound broke the moment, the weak puppy shifting again, and Grace lifted her head, amber eyes alert. She rose slowly, carefully, and with deliberate motion, picked up the smallest pup and carried it a short distance toward Michael, placing it directly in front of him. Her gaze never wavered, her expression calm, resolute. Michael froze, the weight of the gesture landing with unexpected force. Emily watched, her breath catching slightly, and then she nodded, understanding exactly what was being offered. "That's how mothers pass the watch," she said softly. "Not by asking, by trusting." Michael reached out, his hand steady now, and took the fragile life Grace had placed before him, feeling the warmth of it seep into his palms. Outside, the light grew stronger, the day fully awake, and inside the cabin, 3 survivors, man, woman, and dog, found themselves bound together by a battle that did not need weapons to be real. The afternoon light came thin and pale through the cabin windows, the kind that lingered uncertainly in late winter, as if the sun itself were cautious about making promises it could not yet keep, and within that gentle glow, the smallest puppy finally breathed without struggle, its chest rising in a steadier rhythm that loosened something tight and aching in Michael Harris's chest. He noticed the change not all at once, but in increments, the way one notices healing by absence rather than arrival, fewer pauses between breaths, a faint warmth returning to the tiny body cradled in his hands, and when he looked up he found Grace watching him with quiet intensity, her amber eyes clear, her posture no longer rigid with exhaustion but alert and grounded, the strength returning to her frame now that the night had released its grip. Emily Walker sat nearby on a low stool, her coat folded over the back of a chair, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms marked by faint veins and old scars, the practical traces of a life spent tending rather than being tended to. Her hair loosened from its knot and falling in soft gray-brown strands around her face. And she nodded once when she saw Michael's expression change, the smallest smile touching her lips before she turned her attention back to the fire, adding a log with the careful economy of someone who knew how to conserve warmth without waste. The cabin no longer felt like a place holding its breath. It had filled with sound, the quiet squeaks of puppies shifting, the soft scrape of claws on wood, the low thrum of Grace's breathing, and Michael found himself moving through the space without hesitation, fetching water, tearing cloth into clean strips, measuring time by needs rather than memories. He fed the puppies with patience, learning the subtle differences between them, the stronger ones nudging forward with insistence, the weaker lingering at the edges, and he adjusted without frustration, surprised by the steadiness in his hands, by the way responsibility anchored him rather than weighed him down. Grace followed him closely at first, her movements cautious but confident, her coat drying and fluffing with warmth, the gaunt lines of her ribs softening as Emily coaxed her to eat small portions. And when Grace finally settled under the eaves outside, choosing the sheltered patch of porch where the sun reached in a narrow band, Michael felt a quiet relief he did not question. Emily stayed longer than she had planned, first because the puppy needed watching, then because the cabin needed tending, and finally because neither of them suggested she leave, and the hours stretched into a rhythm that felt almost natural, cooking simple meals together from what Michael had stored, soup simmering gently while the puppies slept, bread warmed near the hearth, the ordinary acts of care weaving something steady between them. Emily moved through the kitchen with ease, her frame slight but capable, her hands sure as she chopped and stirred, and Michael found himself watching her without self-consciousness, noticing the way she paused before lifting a heavy pot, mindful of her joints, noticing too the calm authority with which she took small pains in stride, the legacy of a woman who had learned long ago that endurance did not require hardness. They spoke in fragments at first, practical exchanges about food and repairs, then gradually longer stretches of conversation unfolded, Emily telling him about the farmhouse she kept down the slope, the quiet evenings she spent reading or mending, the way the mountain had become both refuge and reminder after her husband's death, and Michael listening with an attention that surprised him, offering his own pieces in return, stories of missions stripped of drama, of camaraderie that felt distant now, of the wife he had loved with a quiet fierceness, a woman whose laughter had once filled this cabin and whose words still echoed in his head when the nights grew long. "You weren't meant to live alone," he repeated aloud at one point, the sentence heavy but not painful, and Emily met his gaze without flinching, her eyes reflecting understanding rather than sympathy. The day warmed enough for them to step outside, and together they repaired the porch where Grace had chosen to rest, Michael replacing loose boards with practiced skill, his movements precise, Emily handing him tools and holding planks steady, her gloves smudged with dirt and sawdust, both of them working in comfortable silence broken only by the thud of hammer and the distant call of a bird testing the air. Grace lay nearby, eyes half closed, the puppies tumbling clumsily in the patch of sunlight, their awkward play sending small bursts of sound into the stillness, and Michael felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not joy exactly, but a sense of rightness he had not known how to name. As the light shifted toward late afternoon, the air cooled again, and Emily suggested they move the puppies closer to the door, easing the transition between warmth and cold, her voice gentle but certain, and Michael followed her lead without resistance, aware that trust had crept in quietly between them, built not on declarations but on shared work and unspoken care. When they finally sat down together on the porch steps, mugs of tea warming their hands, Grace stretched at their feet, her breathing slow and content, and the puppies clustered in a sleepy heap, Michael felt the day settle into him like a memory he would want to keep. Emily spoke then of her husband, not with bitterness but with clarity, describing a man defined by quiet duty, an officer who had believed in finishing what he started and never had the chance to come home. And Michael listened, his own losses echoing hers, the parallels drawing them closer without urgency. He told her of his wife in return, of the way she had challenged him to imagine a life beyond survival, and as the sun dipped behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the snow, Emily reached out and placed her hand over his. The gesture simple and unassuming, not meant to comfort or console but to anchor, to say without words that staying was possible. Michael did not pull away. He let his hand remain beneath hers, feeling the warmth of it, the steadiness, the quiet agreement to exist together in that moment, and as Grace sighed and settled more deeply into her rest, the cabin behind them glowing softly, Michael understood that something fundamental had shifted, not because the pain was gone, but because it no longer stood alone. Spring arrived in the Blue Ridge Mountains the way healing often does, not all at once, not with celebration, but quietly and persistently, nudging the cold back inch by inch, until one morning Michael Harris stepped onto the porch and realized the air no longer hurt to breathe. The snow that had once buried the path to his cabin had thinned into narrow white veins retreating beneath dark soil and fallen needles. And the forest smelled different now, damp and alive, carrying hints of moss, thawing earth, and something like promise. The puppies noticed first. What had once been a cluster of trembling bodies near the hearth had grown into a chaotic, joyful tangle of legs and tails, their coats thickening, their movements clumsy but confident as they chased one another across the yard, tumbling into one another without fear. Michael watched them from the porch, a mug of coffee warming his hands, his broad frame relaxed against the railing, the lines in his face softened by a quiet smile he no longer tried to suppress. Grace lay nearby in the sun, her black and tan coat glossy now, her body strong and well-fed, eyes half-closed, but always tracking the movement of her young with a vigilance that had not dimmed even as danger passed. She was still a guardian, but no longer a desperate one. As weeks turned into months, neighbors began to visit the cabin more often, drawn by word of mouth, by Emily Walker's gentle encouragement, by the simple human need to witness something that had gone right. Families came slowly up the dirt road, boots muddy, children wide-eyed, and one by one the puppies found homes, leaving the cabin in pairs of excited hands and hopeful promises. Michael took each departure harder than he expected, standing quietly as cars disappeared down the mountain. But Grace surprised him each time, watching calmly, accepting each goodbye without protest, her trust in the world renewed. When the last puppy left, Grace did not follow. She returned to the porch, settled beside Michael, and rested her head against his leg, as if the choice had been made without discussion. The cabin changed after that. It no longer echoed with absence or the constant vigilance of survival. It filled instead with routine, with the sounds of daily life. Emily's laughter drifting through open windows, the scrape of chairs on wood, the steady rhythm of shared mornings. Emily moved into a small rented cottage further down the ridge, close enough to walk up most days, her presence becoming as familiar and grounding as the mountains themselves. She was still slender, still carried herself with quiet dignity, her hair now worn loose more often, catching the sunlight in silver strands, her face softened by peace rather than marked by loss. They did not announce anything, did not define what had grown between them, because neither felt the need. Each morning they drank coffee together on the porch, Grace lying between them, the silence companionable rather than heavy. And Michael found that the man he had once been, always braced, always waiting for impact, had begun to stand down without fear. It was Emily who suggested the rescue center. Cedar Ridge sat on the edge of the county, a modest place run by volunteers who understood animals the way soldiers understood terrain. And Michael listened when she spoke of it, not because she persuaded him, but because something in him recognized the truth of her words. He drove there one afternoon alone, the road winding through green hills, And when he stepped out of his truck, he felt the same nervous energy he used to feel before a mission, the awareness that something important might begin. The people there welcomed him without ceremony, noticing his calm hands, his attentiveness, his instinctive understanding of boundaries, and before long he found himself returning regularly, fixing fences, building shelters, walking dogs who needed strength more than affection. He did not wear his past like armor there, and no one asked him to. At the cabin, Grace aged gracefully into her role as constant companion, her muzzle slowly graying, her movements measured but confident, and Michael adjusted his pace to match hers without resentment. Emily's cottage became another extension of home, her kitchen smelling of bread and herbs, her shelves lined with books she loved, and sometimes Michael found himself there late into the evening, repairing a loose hinge or simply sitting at the table listening as she read aloud, her voice steady and warm. The seasons turned fully, winter retreating into memory, and one morning Michael stood beneath a sky washed clean by rain, holding a small wooden sign he had carved himself, the letters simple and uneven, but certain. He hung it above the porch where Grace had first stood that night months before, snow falling from her fur, hope trembling in her jaws. The sign read, "This door stays open." Emily stepped up beside him then, her hand slipping easily into his, her smile quiet and knowing, and Grace lay down at their feet, content, the mountain breeze moving gently through her fur. Michael looked out across the land he had once used as a hiding place and understood, finally, that love had not come to rescue him or Emily or Grace from what they had lost. It had come to remind them, patiently and without demand, that they were still worthy of what remained. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not arrive with thunder, fire, or unmistakable signs from heaven. They arrive quietly, wrapped in ordinary moments, carried on tired feet and faithful hearts. In this story, the miracle was not only that lives were saved from the cold, but that hearts long closed were gently reopened. God's grace often works this way in our daily lives, not by erasing our wounds, but by placing something fragile in our care and reminding us that love, compassion, and responsibility are still possible. Like Michael, many of us walk through life believing we must face everything alone, yet God sends small invitations, an unexpected visitor, a chance to help, a moment to stay instead of walk away, to lead us back to connection and purpose. If this story touched you, consider how a quiet act of kindness in your own life might be the doorway to healing for someone else, or even for yourself. Please share this story with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment about a moment when you felt God's presence in an ordinary day, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of faith, compassion, and second chances. May God bless you, keep you safe through every season, and fill your home with warmth, peace, and the quiet light of His grace.